Ever wondered how to go about performing live using Ableton? Well, let me show you one of the ways that I do it. What's going on, everyone? Matt, aka Martin here. I recently teamed up with Innovative Music Australia and Novation to do a little live performance video showcasing how I use Novation gear in my live setup. And if you haven't seen that video yet, make sure to go check it. I'll put a link down in the description. But today I thought it'd be a really cool idea to show you some of the behind the scenes of the Ableton session and the setup for how I went about creating this live set, and also talk about some of the considerations I make and that you should make when pulling together a live set for yourself using Ableton Live. So first off, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you need to take into consideration before you even start pulling together a live set using Ableton Live. There are a few things that it's good to kind of get your head around and get your head in the space of before you even start putting anything in and creating any kind of session or anything like that. So for me, performing live is all about striking a balance between being performative and having fun. I want to make sure that I'm doing enough on stage so that I'm having fun and it's also engaging for the audience, but not doing too much that I'm in way over my head and just struggling to even focus on one thing at a time. I also always try to make sure that there's something for me to be doing at pretty much every point throughout the set, but also try to leave some moments where I can just take a bit of a break, let the music play out, dance along with it, because after all, it is electronic dance music that I primarily play. So when putting together a set, it's always worth thinking about what you're going to be doing throughout any given song. Whether that's playing an instrument, singing along to it, playing some kind of drum pads, triggering effects, just dancing around, whatever. It's always worth knowing what you're going to be doing roughly at any given point in time. Another thing that you should take into consideration is the gear you're going to be using on stage. As an electronic music performer, we have so much gear at our disposal. Our sets are pretty much completely customizable, and the gear that you have will probably differ from the gear that someone else has, and everything offers a huge amount of options. Are you going to be just using a single piece of kit like a launch pad, or are you going to be incorporating something like a keyboard or even another launch pad, or maybe like a drum pad, even singing or live looping, etc., anything in it as well? All of that needs to be taken into consideration. For the setup I'm going to be showing you today, I've used a Launchpad Pro Mark III, a Launchpad MIDI Mark III, and a Launch Key 49 Mark III as well, all by, of course, Novation. So once you've thought about all these kind of things, you should have a fairly good idea of the kind of set and performance you want to create. Whether it's going to be mostly pre-programmed or if there's going to be a lot of live improvisational elements or a mixture of the two, it's totally up to you. For me personally, I like to mostly pre-program a lot of my sets so that I can really focus in on whatever it is I'm doing at any given point in the performance and not have to worry about constantly all of these things going on at once, which can just be way too overwhelming for when you're on stage. All right, so now you've decided on how you're going to approach your live set. So now let's dive into Ableton Live and show you exactly how I put together the live set for the Innovative Music Australia and Novation performance that I did. All right, so here we are inside of Ableton Live. Now, the first thing that I do when faced with creating a new set is make sure that I have all of the tracks that I'm going to play or that I want to play all stemmed out into separate stems. If I switch over to Arrangement View, you'll see here that I have a bunch of stems all laid out in my arrangement view. And these are all different stems of different tracks, particularly the different tracks that I'm going to be playing. So when stemming out my tracks, I like to stem it out into kick, drums, synths 1 and 2, or even synths 1, 2, and 3, bass 1, 2, possibly up to 3, vocals 1, 2, possibly up to 3, and other, which is kind of effects and anything else like that, 1, 2, and again, possibly up to 3 as well. This will vary from tune to tune, depending on whether or not I've busted all into a single drum bus or whatever. And typically I export my stems after the final mix has been done so that I know there's not going to be any changes made to them that I need to fix or address in this particular session. The only thing that I might find myself having to do when working with stems from multiple tracks is, as you'll see here, we have some volume variation amongst some of our different stems here. So I might just apply general clip gain to all of the stems in order to even them out. So I would just select them all, hit Shift and Tab, and then come down to my clip gain here. And you can see I've already pulled this up just to make sure that it matches all of the other tracks in my set. you want to make sure you maintain a consistent volume throughout. And in fact, I have some effects on my master to help with this as well, but we'll get to them later on. Another thing to take into consideration when stemming out tracks, particularly for live performance, is whether or not there are any elements you want to get rid of before you stem out those tracks. For instance, if there's a synth line that you really want to play live, it's probably best idea to not have that actually in the stems, or at least have that stemmed out as its own separate track so that you can not have it playing at the same time as you playing it, or you can just have it a little bit lower in volume to reinforce whatever it is you're going to be playing over the top of it. All right, so once we've stemmed out our tracks, the next thing to do is import them. So as you can see here inside of this Ableton Live session, I have this tracks group here in which I have basically created essentially a track for all of the different stems that I'm going to be using. You can see I've got a kick, a drums, which is also a group which contains 2 different tracks in here, a synths 1, a synths 2, a bass group, which contains bass 1 and bass 2, Vox group, which contains Vox 1 and Vox 2, and other 1 and other 2. These could all be grouped together, so I could group, for instance, this other 1 and other 2 together, whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm not using these particular tracks to trigger any clips or anything in session view. I am purely just arranging these stems out in arrangement view and then basically playing stuff over the top of them. So once you've imported all of your stems and you've made your volume adjustments, etc., you need to also make sure that everything is set to the right tempo, which is a consideration to make when you are importing your stems. The best way to make sure that everything is in the right tempo is, of course, making sure that when you export your stems, you label them with the tempo, or you have some kind of a list that has the tempo of all of your tracks, so you know exactly what the tempo is of those tracks, and you can simply just warp them to the tempo by going into, for instance, the drum stem, opening it up, warping it, clicking this warp button, and typing in the BPM value in the segment BPM, and that will make it so that your stem warps to the correct tempo. And once you've made sure that all of your tracks are set to be the right tempo and are all warped correctly, then you can start thinking about ordering your tracks. So obviously the order of your tracks is completely over to you, but there are a few things to take into consideration, of course. Because this is a live set and not a DJ set, you can absolutely schedule in breaks if you want to. So for instance, maybe you have 5, 6 tunes, followed by a little bit of a break for you to interact with the audience or do something else like that, then into another song. So figure out exactly how you're going to structure your set in terms of energy, vibe, perhaps key changes, tempo changes, etc., and where you're going to take those breaks, if you're going to take any breaks at all. Now, one of the reasons that I'm stemming out my tracks in this particular way, instead of just using a, for instance, stereo bounce of the master, is because it allows me to create some interesting different transitions by layering different stems together and basically crossfading between tracks, but in a different and unique way that you wouldn't be able to do with just a stereo track. So for instance here, let me show you this transition between my track It's All You and then the remix I did for Surrender's Disappear. We can see here that in the bridge section of It's All You, we actually have the 2 stems, the drum stem and the kick stem from my Surrender Disappear remix coming in over the top of the rest of this tune. And then also the synths here fading in as well, and the bass, as well as obviously these effects down here. Now, doing it this way allows you to effectively kind of dovetail the 2 different tracks together in a way that's a little bit more interesting, pleasing, and customizable to you. This is almost where you kind of go about producing your live set. And for instance, if you wanted to change the kick pattern, you could absolutely do that too. You could maybe delete this part and you could maybe delete this part, for instance, or you could delete some of the drums, etc. You can go ham and you can basically create really customized, interesting transitions, changes, effects, etc. Everything you want to do with a bunch of different stems, which can lead to some really interesting, cool and fun and unique live edits. So obviously lining up all your tracks like this is all well and great, but what if you have tempo changes which you most likely inevitably will unless you're working at the same tempo throughout your entire set, which you may want to consider having some tempo changes throughout. Well, this is where we can start to use a little bit of a feature inside of Ableton Live, which is the tempo leader and follower, which is inside of our clips. Now here I don't actually have any tempo changes because these are all at the same tempo. It was only a 5-minute little performance, so there was no need to shift tempo at all. But let's say that, for instance, this particular track here was a different tempo to this track. I could go in here and open this up. And in fact, actually it is a different tempo. I've just played it at the faster tempo to avoid having to drop down by 2 BPM, which is of course something you can do as well. But from here, what we can do is actually just click on this leader follow button. And if I click on this, what this is going to do is effectively automate the tempo just for this particular section of the tune so that whatever the segment BPM of this particular clip is at any given point in time becomes the master tempo during that point in time as well. And you can see as soon as I clicked that, we now have this section here. If I unclick that, you can see that goes away and we're allowed to now automate our tempo again. But if we click on that follower leader button, we're now automating the tempo for that particular stretch here. And then once you've set all of your clips that you want to be leaders and you've got in all of that rough tempo automation, you can simply right click on your tempo automation lane and unfollow the tempo automation. And then you can zoom in and create any smooth ramps or anything like that that you want in order to make the transitions just a little bit smoother. I'm going to undo all that because we don't want to be shifting this too much around here. Let me close up the automation, close up the clip. And that is essentially how I've gone about arranging this here. As you can see, I've got a lot of dovetailing of different stems. I've chopped up different sections, etc. I've even got little bits of this vocal throughout the drop of another tune. This is the really, really fun thing about having multiple stems inside of your live sessions, is that you can just go crazy with it if you want to. Cool. And then if I go up to the top of our session here, you'll see that I've actually got a click or a cue group. Now that's because I'm using actually in-ear monitors for this particular performance, which allows me to have a separate click track going into my ears without that being sent to front of house or through the actual PA system, which is really useful for sections that don't actually have any drums and where I need to be playing some sort of an instrument, such as during this particular piano break section in my track, It's All You.
Our minds racing, diving into an ocean.
Now you'll notice essentially what I've got here is I've got a click track that is routed out to this cue track here. And this cue track is also receiving input from the master post the master's mixer. So everything is going into the master, and then the cue track is receiving the master and the click track, and the click track is not being sent out of the master track. And this cue track is being sent to a separate output on my audio interface, which is not currently set up at the moment, so that's why it's grayed out. But if I just route this click track to our master, you can hear what it now sounds like.
Our minds racing.
So this is what I'd be hearing in my ears on stage, but coming out the front of it would just be this, no click. And you'll also notice I don't have the click going throughout the entirety of the tune, and I'm also not using Ableton Live's metronome. I have a separate click in here, which allows me to just have the click track on when I want it and basically pre-program where I want the click tracks to be. Personally, I don't like listening to a click the whole time. Some people do though, so it's totally over to you. All right, so once we've set up all of our stems and everything, I'm just going to collapse all of these here because we don't need to look at them anymore. You can see I've got a whole bunch of other things here as well, which we'll go into a bunch of these soon. But the next thing that I want to just talk about really quickly is setting up any instruments that you want to play live. So for instance, there might be some sort of synth line, piano line, drum line, etc. that you want to play in time with the backing track that you've set up, or at least that is the case with me. I have keys tracks. I also have some finger drumming and stuff, which I use on my little launch pads, which we'll go to in a second. And I have a few tracks set up for this. You'll see here that I have a keyboard track, which is receiving the input from my launch key, and I have the pads sound track here, which is receiving the input from my Launchpad Pro. Now, I can't show you the launch key because it's under my desk, but I can show you what's going on my Launchpad Pro. All right, so here on my Launchpad Pro, which is this one on my right here, you'll see that I've got a few different colors and stuff going on, but this bottom section here is effectively a drum pad with a bunch of different sounds in them. On the left-hand side here, I've just got a bunch of different sounds, which I play at some given point, which I've already predetermined for the track. And then likewise on the right. I could have this whole thing set up for drum sounds if I wanted to, but we'll get into why I don't later. So when thinking about instruments to play, we of course need to first determine exactly what instruments you want to play. This might be a synth solo, it might be some drums, it might be vocal chops, etc. Then once you've decided on the instrument you want to play and you've imported that instrument into your session, the next thing we need to do is set it up so that we can actually switch instruments automatically between different songs. No doubt you're probably going to be wanting to play different instruments over the top of different songs. If you don't, great, you don't need to do this, but it's very likely you will. So I'm just going to effectively recreate what I've got here from scratch on my pad sounds, and then you can apply this exact technique to any of the other instruments that you want to use. So I'm going to create a new MIDI track, and then on this new MIDI track, let's get rid of these preset effects here. I'm just going to copy and paste this particular drum rack that I've got. Now, this is my drum rack for this first song, but now let's say, what if I wanted a drum rack for my second song as well, and I didn't want to have to manually change this? What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the heading for this device, and I'm going to group it to an instrument rack. Then I'm going to open up the chain selector list and view the chain selector. Now you'll see here that we now have the ability to see a bunch of different zones, 128 different zones to be exact, and effectively switch between a bunch of different chains using this chain select ruler here, which is a parameter that we can actually automate. So let's say that this is our chain list or our instrument for It's All You, and then let's say I had a different instrument rack that I wanted to use for my Disappear remix. I could create the chain here, and I could rename this to Disappear. And then I can come over to here and I can just move the zone so that this little blue icon right here is actually taking up the space of zone 1 instead of zone 0. And now I can find the part in the tune that I want to actually be playing this new instrument rack in. I can right click my chain select ruler and go show automation or show automation in a new lane. And now I can just find that part, maybe it's right here, and you can see I've already done that here on this pad sounds track. And if I just expand this a little bit, we can now, for this whole surrender disappear section, have it so that this chain selector gets automated to be on chain 1. And now all of these pads that I have set up here will automatically change from being the It's All You instrument to the Disappear instrument throughout the song for Disappear. Then if I had another instrument rack, let's create another chain, for instance, for the next song, make this chain number 2. I could do the exact same thing, and I could just automate this particular section to be chain number 2. And now I effectively have an automatically changing instrument throughout the entirety of my set without having to manually switch patches or anything like that. Now, if you have any hardware gear, this is also absolutely doable as well through MIDI program changes, but I'm not using hardware gear in this particular performance, so we're not going to go into that. But you'll see if I come down to my keyboard section, I have exactly done this as well. There's a bunch more automation here, and in much larger sets, you will possibly have a lot more automation of device switching going on here. Once you've set up all of that, you also need to make sure that your particular MIDI track is set to receive the right MIDI information from a given device. Device meaning some kind of hardware device. So we don't want, for instance, the settings or the messages from my Launchpad Mini being also sent to this instrument track that we want to be controlled via our Launchpad Pro. So in order to do this, we need to make sure we have our input-output section open up with this I/O section right here. Come to this first drop-down menu and just select the device that we want to control this particular instrument track. Now you'll see there's a few different Launchpad Pros here. If you don't see the right one that you want, or you don't see whatever instrument that you want here. You can simply open up your preferences, come down to link, tempo, and MIDI, and then make sure that you have track and remote selected for whichever ones you want. And also if you need to have sync, you can have sync as well. I'm not going to dive into exactly what these do right now, but generally you'll want track and remote on. So let's set that up. We can just click on this. So Launchpad Pro MIDI, and then you need to make sure that it's receiving the correct MIDI channel. If you don't know what MIDI channel your particular device is set to output, that's okay. You just need to look in your device's software or in its manual, etc. You can look at how to change that MIDI channel and all of that. And you'll notice I have a bunch of different MIDI channels here. And when we get into MIDI mapping, you'll realize why it's important to set a MIDI channel for your different devices so that there's no overlapping if you press, say, the same note on a different MIDI channel. So it's really important to not have all channels selected and have a specific MIDI channel selected, especially if you're going to be using multiple MIDI channels on a single device, which you may indeed be doing. Hello, Future Matt here. Also, just a really quick note that you also need to make sure the track is set to monitor in. There's three little options. There's in, auto, and off. Also, make sure that the track is set to the monitor in option for when setting up an instrument like this to make sure that it is consistently and constantly receiving MIDI messages from your specified device. But that's how we go about setting up our instruments. And this technique is applicable to pretty much any device that you want to use and any instrument or any amount of instruments that you want to use inside of your session. And it's really, really useful. So I'm just going to delete that MIDI track here because we don't need that. And now I want to talk about basically what makes up the majority of my performance, which is effectively how I've routed my effects. So what I use with my Launchpad Mini here, I use this pretty much basically as a glorified effects unit. All of these different pads here are actually clips in my session view. And you'll see this green box around this series of 8x8 clips is actually denoting what my Launchpad Mini is seeing. If I go to the left one, you'll see that move. If I go to the right one, you'll see it move back. Now, these particular clips don't actually contain any audio. Instead, what they're doing is just being used as what we call dummy clips in order to automate a bunch of different effects that I have on those tracks. Now let me just unfold this drum bus group here and also just expand out all of these tracks. And you'll see here that I actually have my kick drum track, which is my kick drum stem track being sent to my drum bus, my drums being sent to my drum bus, then my synths 1 being sent to instrument bus 1, synths 2 also being sent to instrument bus 1, I'll get to why in a second, bass group all being sent to instruments bus 1, vox group being sent to vox bus, and the other tracks being sent just to my master effects. You could of course also have an other bus if you wanted to, or send these other tracks to your instrument bus, totally over to you. So effectively what I'm doing here is busing groups of instruments together so that I can control them all with single effects units or multiple effects units. So I'm just going to collapse these down again so we can have a look at exactly what's going on with the effects. Let's first of all just dive into our drum bus group here. So I actually have kicks and drums being sent to this first drum bus track. And you'll notice that this is actually a grouped drum bus track. So we have kick and drums being sent into this drum bus, and this drum bus is being sent into drum bus 2, and then drum bus 2 is being sent into our master effects, which is contained in this little group right here. I've really just grouped this just for organizational purposes, this particular one, but this particular one is grouped for a very different reason. So let me collapse this. Now you'll notice here that on my Launchpad Mini, I have an 8x8 area to work with. And if I have these unfolded, there's obviously more than 8 particular columns here, which means that if I wanted to be using all of these effects at once, I'd have to be going back and forth. So it's kind of limiting and also depends on the hardware you have. But what we've got here is if we jump into our drums bus, I simply just have a single beat repeat on this drums bus track. And inside of each of these clips, which are just single pieces of audio that actually don't contain any audio in them, they're just silence, I actually have some automation on this particular beat repeat. And you'll notice that this automation is set for the first 30-second note of this particular clip. Now I have an automation for the device on parameter, as well as an automation for the grid parameter, and also filter frequency and repeat parameter. Now, why do I have it set to be a 1/32nd note? That's because I want this effect to be a momentary effect, which means that I want to be able to press and hold down that effect and it to trigger for as long as I'm holding it down for. Then as soon as I release my finger off of that, it stops the effect playing altogether. And you might think that this is easy to do, but it's actually a little bit kind of convoluted. So for those of you that don't know what dummy clips are, effectively dummy clips are just clips. They can be audio clips, generally audio clips, sometimes MIDI clips as well, that are just on an audio track that don't contain any audio and are simply used to automate parameters of a device. So in this particular case, this dummy clip is being used to automate our beat repeat. Now, I also have the launch mode for this dummy clip set to something different. If I come up to the top left here, you can see that we can actually expand open this view. This is an Ableton Live 11 thing. And we have this launch section down the bottom here. Now you'll see this little drop-down menu that says repeat. This is often set to trigger. You can also set it to gate and toggle. I have it set to repeat here. Now, why do I have it set to repeat? I have it set to repeat so that it basically repeats at a certain quantized value, which I've set to 1/32nd notes, which is the fastest value that it can be quantized at, whilst I'm holding down the clip. And then when I let go of the clip, it will stop repeating the clip and just play it out until the end. You'll also notice that I have not looped this clip so that it does not go back to the start of the clip when I'm not holding down the clip trigger. All right, so now let's go to a place in our arrangement where the drums are actually playing so that I can show you exactly what's happening here. Let me solo this drums bus and just go here and play. Now, if I play this and just hold down one of these, you'll hear what's actually happening. So it's a really expressive way of doing effects. Now, if I go back into our clip here, we can see that this has only automated these parameters. And if I actually have a look down here on this effect whilst I'm playing these, you can see all of those parameters being automated. And you can see that I'm only automating them for that first 32nd note of each of these particular clips. And so what that's doing is repeating this first 32nd note for as long as I'm holding down this particular clip for. And then after I let go of the clip plays out and turns off that particular effect. And then once that clip has played out to the end, it stops playing the clip. As far as I'm aware, this is the only way to get momentary effects to work with dummy clips, and it works pretty well once you have it all set up and know how to do it. Now, I have these two buses here actually grouped together so that I can view them all as a single track on my Launchpad Mini here, but I can actually have it so that I have the second drum bus effects actually playing at the same time as I have the first drum bus effect playing, because unfortunately, one of the limitations with dummy clips is that of course you can't have two dummy clips on the same track playing at any given time, which means that if I wanted to have this beat repeat and this verb send, for instance, playing at the same time, I would have to do exactly what I've done here and send the beat repeat into the verb send or whatever I've got here on this second drum bus effects. So we have to kind of stack effects in that way. And then you'll notice here, I've actually got pretty similar effects on our instrument bus. So instrument bus 1 has our beat repeats, which then goes into instrument bus 2, which is some slices. Then I've got some other wubs and then other stuff, and then a bunch of stuff on the master effects as well. I have some pitch down effects on the vocals, and all of this is just finding cool things to automate and just doing that exact same process of looping or setting a clip to repeat mode on 30-second notes, automating exactly what I want to automate for that first 30-second note, making sure to automate the device on for that 30-second note and then off for the rest of the clip. And then pretty much do anything else you want in that particular amount of time. And so if I unsolo this and just have a bit of a play, you can hear exactly what this sounds like when it's being finished. Pretty cool, really expressive and fun way to play effects whilst not kind of just turning knobs and using filters and stuff. This is a much more interesting, I feel, and fun way to actually play effects live. So you'll notice, obviously, I've got my drum bus, instrument buses, Vox bus, Master Effects bus, then another Master Effects bus using this exact same grouping technique, into another Master Effects bus, and then into another Master Effects bus. You'll notice that I haven't utilized every single slot here. The idea is to eventually utilize every single slot, but it can kind of be hard to figure out what effects to use at any given point in time. And this is absolutely a living project, meaning that it's constantly in development. And because of this, I'll be adding more effects in the future and taking away ones that don't work and adding some new ones that I feel like could be interesting. So the final thing I wanted to chat about really quickly is MIDI mapping. So you'll also notice here that particularly if I go to my main Master Effects track, I have a bunch of audio effect racks, which if I open up, have a few macros on. Now these macros are again just pretty much one knob effects, but if I open up my MIDI mapping menu with Command and M, you'll notice that I have a few things MIDI mapped here. Now a bunch of these are actually MIDI mapped to sliders and knobs on my launch key controller, and this allows me to just basically have more effects options throughout. And if we have a look here over on our MIDI mapping menu, you'll see we have the channel here, and our note controls, and then the paths. And also I've remapped some of the minimum and maximum values. No, actually I haven't in this particular case, but you definitely can when it comes to racks and everything like that, which if you want me to do a video on making some cool instrument effect racks, I can absolutely do that. Just let me know down in the comments. And you'll also notice that I've also got notes and stuff mapped to transport controls, as well as jumping between locators in my particular session inside of the arrangement view, which is a great way to just make sure that you are always set to the right moment of your performance, particularly if you have breaks as well. Now, one final thing that I just want to draw attention to is also what I'm doing here with this particular Launchpad controller. I have the top row here of pads actually mapped to the mutes of the different stems, which is why I have them all grouped this way. So there's 8 of them. If you keep an eye down here on the track mutes, you'll notice that when I do this, they all turn off, and then I can turn them all back on. Let me deselect them so I can do them one at a time. And you can see that I can basically use this top row on my Launchpad Pro to mute or unmute different tracks to again just give me a little bit more flexibility, which is another cool reason why using stems is great. Now obviously I haven't utilized everything I could possibly use here. I obviously don't have any sends or returns in here, which you could absolutely have some send return setups. You could also, if you wanted to, map things like solo controls or panning, I suppose, or pretty much anything else in here that you had a spare control, a spare knob, fader, and want to be like, oh, I could just map that to something. You could absolutely do that in here. Now, jumping back to the effects really quickly, I also have, you'll notice on my Launchpad Pro, this kind of middle row here, which is actually some what I've dubbed as MPE effects, which is effectively allowing me to play expressively via polyphonic aftertouch different effects and macros that I've created here in my session. I'll do a whole video on this later because it's kind of complicated and this video is getting really long already, but keep an eye out for that one. And let me just show you a little bit of what this can actually do. So you'll kind of notice there, hopefully it's visible through the camera, that when I'm pressing down harder on a particular pad, it actually moves the positioning of that macro. And I'm doing that through the expression control MIDI effect, which I have mapped in a really interesting way, which again, I'll go into in a different video. Then the final thing that we have is some really basic compression on the master. I have a limiter because obviously I don't want to be going crazy, crazy loud coming out of here. I have some really, really basic and subtle multiband compression and also some really basic glue compression just to catch any extraneous peaks, because obviously these tracks aren't mastered, they're just stemmed together mixes, and particularly if I'm doing wild effects and everything like that, it could get pretty loud. So I just need some stuff on the master to make sure it all balances out. Now that was a pretty extensive look at my live set. Hopefully it was easy enough to follow. I know there was a little bit of rambling going on there, but hopefully that gives you some ideas as to how you can put together your own live set using Ableton Live. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in a comment below. And if you enjoyed the video, of course, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you really, really enjoyed the video, make sure to head to the link in the description to buy me a coffee, where you can just support the channel and support me by simply buying me a coffee. And you can also get some really cool things. And also let me know down in the comments how you put together your live set. And if you have any cool tips, tricks, and techniques that you'd like to share with the rest of the world, then of course put them down in the comment section below as well. But that's it from me today, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've gotten a lot out of it, and I will see you all in the next one.